The morning after the separation did not arrive with drama. No slammed doors, no raised voices echoing down a hallway. Just light, thin, undecided light, slipping through the curtains of a room that suddenly felt too large for one person. Lillian Dube sat still longer than usual, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular, as if the walls themselves might explain what had happened. Silence pressed in, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, practiced silence of someone who has learned to survive by saying very little out loud. For years, that silence had followed her everywhere. On sets, among friends, even in rooms full of laughter, it lingered just behind her eyes. People mistook it for strength, for dignity, for privacy. What they never saw was how loud it was inside her head, how every unspoken sentence stacked itself neatly away, waiting for the right moment, or perhaps for the courage to admit that the moment had already passed. After the breakup, many expected a statement, a neat explanation, something reassuring, something controlled. But nothing came. Days turned into weeks, and still she said nothing. Not because there was nothing to confess, but because confession has a cost. And for someone who had spent so long protecting a fragile balance, breaking that silence felt more dangerous than enduring it. Those close to her noticed the change long before the public did. A different tiredness. Not physical, but the kind that settles into posture and breath. The kind that comes from carrying a story you're not allowed to tell, even to yourself. She smiled less, spoke more carefully, as if every word needed to be weighed against years of compromise. This was not the exhaustion of a recent heartbreak. It was older, deeper, as if the marriage had been ending in fragments for a very long time. When she finally allowed herself to speak, quietly, without spectacle, it wasn't the separation she acknowledged first. It was the loneliness that preceded it, the feeling of being present but unseen, of sharing a home while slowly retreating into separate emotional rooms. She didn't frame it as betrayal or failure. Instead, she described something more unsettling, a relationship that looked intact from the outside, while quietly hollowing itself out from within. There were moments, she admitted, when she realized she was performing happiness rather than living it. Moments when she recognized her own reflection and felt strangely distant from it. She spoke of conversations that never happened, of needs that were postponed until they eventually stopped asking to be met. None of it sounded explosive. That was the most shocking part. The pain had been too orderly, too polite to draw attention. Listening closely, one could sense that her admission wasn't about assigning blame. It was about naming a truth that had been carefully avoided. A truth many had suspected, but few expected her to say out loud. That the marriage had been unhappy not because of one dramatic rupture, but because of a slow, mutual erosion neither person knew how to stop. She paused often as she spoke, as if testing each sentence against memory. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a measured clarity that comes after years of emotional negotiation. She acknowledged her own role in staying silent for too long, in mistaking endurance for love. And in that admission lay something unsettlingly familiar, an echo of countless relationships that end quietly long before they are officially over. What lingered most was not what she said, but what remained unsaid. The spaces between her words carried more weight than any headline ever could. It left one uneasy question hanging in the air, unresolved and uncomfortable. How many marriages don't actually end on the day people separate, but much earlier, in the long stretch of silence when no one dares to admit what they already know? To the public, Lillian Dube has always appeared unmistakably solid. On screen, she carries a presence that fills space with ease, sharp timing, warm humor, a confidence that feels earned rather than performed. Audiences know her laugh. They trust her expressions. She is the kind of woman who seems unbreakable, the kind people assume has already solved life's hardest questions. In interviews, she often sounds grounded, self-aware, almost reassuring. Someone who has seen enough to not be shaken easily. That image has been carefully reinforced over time. Strong woman. Veteran. Survivor. A familiar face that brings comfort. When she speaks publicly, there is a rhythm to her voice that suggests control, as if every sentence has already been tested against doubt and released only when it feels safe. Viewers recognize this version of her instantly. It is the Lillian Dube they think they know. But behind that public fluency exists another tempo entirely. Away from cameras and applause, the woman is quieter. Not withdrawn, just economical with herself. Words are chosen sparingly. Personal questions are gently redirected. When conversations drift toward marriage, there is often a pause, almost imperceptible, before she shifts the topic. Not abruptly, smoothly, as though she has learned, over time, how to step around certain truths without drawing attention to the movement. Those who have spent time with her off stage describe a different energy. Thoughtful, watchful. A woman who listens more than she speaks, who allows silences to stretch without rushing to fill them. There is no need to explain herself there, and yet she rarely does. It's not secrecy for its own sake. It feels more like self-preservation, as if too much openness might disturb a fragile inner order she has worked hard to maintain. In private spaces, the strength people admire so easily looks less like armor and more like discipline. The discipline of staying composed when emotions press for acknowledgement. The discipline of keeping one part of life neatly folded away while another is put on display. She has mastered this separation so well that many never realized there was a divide at all. What makes this contrast unsettling is how seamless it has always appeared. The public persona never cracked. There were no obvious warning signs, no moments of visible collapse. Even during periods when her marriage was quietly unraveling, she showed up, delivered performances, shared jokes, fulfilled expectations. The image remained intact, while something else, something deeply personal, was being steadily withdrawn from view. It becomes clear, listening to her now, that the avoidance was never accidental. It was learned behavior. Each time she chose not to elaborate, not to correct assumptions, not to offer context, she was drawing a line between what belonged to the audience and what did not. Marriage, it seems, was always on the other side of that line. The result is a strange duality. A woman millions feel they recognize, and another whom almost no one has truly met. One lives in scripts, sound bites, and familiar frames. The other exists in the quiet after long days, in conversations that stop short of confession, in thoughts that never quite find their way into language. And perhaps that is what feels most disorienting now. The realization that for all these years, there has been a parallel life running beneath the surface. A version of Lillian Dube that the public image never contradicted, but never revealed either. A life shaped by restraint, by careful omissions, by the unspoken understanding that some stories are easier to carry alone than to explain out loud. What she describes, when she allows herself to describe anything at all, is not a marriage marked by explosions. There were no scenes dramatic enough to retell, no single night that could be pointed to as the moment everything broke. Instead, the damage arrived quietly, almost politely, as if it didn't want to be noticed. Lillian Dube speaks of it the way one might speak of a crack in a wall, something small at first, easy to ignore, until one day it becomes impossible not to see. Evenings were often the hardest, not because of arguments, but because of their absence. Two people sharing the same space, the same air, yet moving around each other with the caution of strangers. Television playing in the background, not for entertainment, but to fill the silence neither knew how to break. Conversations reduced to logistics. Who was tired? What needed to be done tomorrow? Nothing that risked touching the truth. There were moments when she would look up mid-sentence and stop, not because she had nothing more to say, but because she sensed, sometimes accurately, sometimes not, that the listening had already ended. The eyes across from her would drift, not deliberately, just enough to signal that her words were landing somewhere else, or nowhere at all. Over time, she learned to shorten her thoughts, to edit herself in advance. Some sentences were never finished. Others were never started. She recalls how avoidance became a language of its own. A glance redirected. A question softened into a joke. A topic postponed until it no longer felt relevant. From the outside, it might have looked like calm, even harmony. Inside, it felt like a slow erasure of needs, of expectations, of the right to be fully present as herself. What makes these memories difficult to articulate is their ordinariness. There is no villain in them, no single act of cruelty, just the steady accumulation of small distances, sitting side by side, but no longer leaning toward each other, sharing a bed while carrying separate worries into sleep, waking up with the faint sense that something essential had already been missed, though no one could say exactly when. She does not speak of being shouted down or dismissed outright. That would have been easier to name. Instead, she talks about the fatigue of repetition, the quiet despair of explaining the same feeling in different words, hoping one of them might finally land, and the deeper hurt when none of them do, when the response is not anger, but indifference, or worse, polite acknowledgement followed by no change at all. In time, the marriage seemed to develop a rhythm of emotional caution. Certain subjects were approached carefully, like unstable ground. Others were avoided completely. The cost of peace became silence, and silence slowly became the norm. It wasn't that love vanished overnight. It thinned, it stretched, it learned how to exist without being spoken. She admits that the most painful realization came not during conflict, but during moments that should have felt intimate. Realizing she no longer felt truly heard, even when words were exchanged. That her presence had become familiar to the point of invisibility. There is a particular kind of loneliness, she suggests, that only exists when you are not alone, when the person closest to you no longer reaches for your inner life. Looking back, she recognizes how easy it was to normalize this state, to call it maturity, to call it endurance, to tell herself that this was simply what long marriages turned into. The absence of noise was mistaken for stability. The lack of confrontation was taken as proof that things were under control. Yet beneath that quiet surface, something fundamental was missing. Not passion, not romance, but recognition. The simple human need to feel that one's inner world still mattered to the person standing beside you. And once that recognition fades, no argument is required for a marriage to begin unraveling. It happens softly, through pauses that last too long, through words that never quite find their way back to the person they were meant for. There is a question that has hovered quietly for years, never printed in headlines, never asked outright, yet somehow always present. It surfaces now not as an accusation, but as a gentle, unsettling possibility. Did she stay longer than she should have? Not out of love, but out of responsibility? When people speak about Lillian Dube, this is the doubt they circle without naming. Not because it is scandalous, but because it is uncomfortably familiar. Responsibility has a way of disguising itself as virtue, especially for women who have been praised all their lives for being strong, dependable, composed. In a marriage, that strength can slowly turn inward, becoming endurance. The decision to stay becomes less about choice and more about obligation, toward shared history, toward appearances, toward the unspoken belief that leaving would mean failing at something one was expected to carry. Many sensed it long before she said anything. Not through words, but through absence. The way joy seemed carefully managed. The way references to home life were kept abstract, almost theoretical. There was warmth, yes, but it felt curated, as though certain doors remained firmly closed. Viewers noticed a distance they couldn't quite explain, a subtle loneliness that didn't fit the image of a fulfilled partnership, yet didn't contradict it either. What people rarely say aloud is that loneliness inside marriage has its own texture. It is not sharp, it is dull. It doesn't demand immediate action. It erodes slowly. For a woman like Lillian, whose life has long involved carrying roles, on screen and off, the line between commitment and self-erasure may have blurred over time. Being needed can easily be mistaken for being loved. Being relied upon can feel, at first, like purpose. When she finally allowed herself to acknowledge this, only briefly, almost reluctantly, her words were spare. No chronology, no details to dissect. Just a simple admission that landed heavier than any explanation could have. She spoke of staying because it felt like the right thing to do, because walking away felt selfish, because she believed patience was a form of loyalty. There was no bitterness in how she said it, only a quiet recognition of the cost of always holding things together, of absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to face it, of choosing stability over truth, again and again, until the difference between the two became impossible to ignore. Her admission did not sound like a revelation meant for public consumption. It sounded more like something she had only recently allowed herself to hear. A realization shaped less by facts than by feeling. That she had been present, responsible, committed, yet increasingly alone. That love, when filtered entirely through duty, can become something hollow, even if it looks intact from the outside. Perhaps this is why the moment resonated so deeply. Not because it exposed a secret, but because it named a condition many recognize but rarely articulate. The quiet bargain women make with themselves. The years spent holding on, hoping persistence might eventually turn into connection again. The fear that leaving would mean admitting the sacrifice was too great. And so the suspicion people carried, unspoken, half denied, finds its shape here. Not in a dramatic confession, but in a restrained acknowledgement. That staying was not always a choice, freely made. That responsibility can keep a marriage standing long after its emotional foundations have thinned. That sometimes the bravest truth is not shouted, but whispered, just enough to finally be heard by the person who needs it most. The moment she spoke was not announced. There was no build-up, no carefully staged reveal. It arrived the way truth often does when it has waited long enough, almost accidentally. Lillian Dube was seated across from an interviewer, the conversation drifting through familiar territory, when a pause settled between two questions. Not an awkward pause, a reflective one, the kind that invites honesty without demanding it. She didn't change her tone, didn't lean forward, didn't signal that something important was coming. In fact, it was easy to miss. A single sentence, spoken softly, almost as an aside. She acknowledged that there had been a long time when she stayed quiet because she believed silence was the kinder option. Kinder to others. Kinder to the idea of stability she had worked so hard to protect. It wasn't framed as a confession, more like an exhale. Those listening closely noticed what was absent. No anger, no recounting of grievances, no need to justify herself. The words carried no sharp edges. Instead, there was a careful calm, as though she had already made peace with the part of the story that hurt the most. What surfaced was not resentment, but relief. The subtle relief of no longer having to pretend that endurance was the same as fulfillment. In another instance, it appeared as a line in a written reflection. Just a few words, placed without emphasis, surrounded by thoughts on growth and timing. She wrote about learning to listen to herself after years of prioritizing what was expected. The sentence didn't accuse anyone. It didn't even name the marriage directly. Yet its meaning was unmistakable. It suggested a quiet turning inward, a decision to finally acknowledge an inner voice that had been patiently waiting. What made the moment resonate was how little she demanded from it. There was no attempt to control how it would be received, no effort to shape a narrative. She allowed the words to exist on their own, trusting that those who understood would understand, and those who didn't were not required to. It felt less like speaking out, and more like setting something down after carrying it for too long. Observers later described a visible shift, not dramatic, but perceptible. A lightness in how she held herself, a softness that didn't come from weakness, but from release. It was as if naming the truth, even briefly, had loosened a grip she hadn't realized she was still maintaining. The past did not need to be rewritten. It simply needed to be acknowledged. She did not frame the moment as closure. There was no declaration of newfound freedom or triumphant self-discovery. Instead, she spoke about space, about breathing, about the quiet relief of no longer negotiating with her own silence. The words suggested that the hardest part was not leaving, but allowing herself to admit why staying had become unbearable. In that understated admission lay the emotional peak of her story. Not because it revealed something shocking, but because it stripped the experience down to its most human core. A woman recognizing that she had done her best with the understanding she had at the time. And that understanding had finally changed. The relief came not from assigning blame, but from finally aligning her inner truth with her outward life, even if only in a whisper. And perhaps that is why the moment lingered. Because it didn't demand attention, yet it held it. Because it didn't seek validation, yet it offered recognition. A small, quiet acknowledgement that carried the weight of years, and, in releasing it, left behind not bitterness, but a gentler, steadier kind of peace. After the separation, life did not suddenly open into brightness. There was no sense of arrival, no dramatic pivot toward joy. What followed was quieter than that, almost deliberately so. Lillian Dube moved through her days without announcing change, without naming it as progress or recovery. If anything, what defined this period most clearly was the absence of performance. Mornings no longer carried the low-grade tension of anticipation of conversations that needed managing, of moods that required adjustment, of silences that had to be interpreted correctly. She woke up and simply began. There was coffee, there was light, there were tasks. None of it was extraordinary, yet none of it demanded calculation. The emotional bookkeeping that once accompanied even small moments had quietly dissolved. She did not speak of freedom. That word felt too large, too celebratory, almost dishonest. What she seemed to experience instead was neutrality. A calm middle ground where nothing needed to be defended. No version of herself had to be upheld for the sake of harmony. No explanations were required for why she felt the way she did, or why she didn't feel anything at all on certain days. Friends noticed it first in the smallest ways. The ease with which she declined invitations without guilt. The way she lingered in conversations without monitoring her tone. The absence of that subtle tension that comes from constantly adjusting oneself to fit a shared emotional space. She was still thoughtful, still considerate, but no longer at the expense of her own inner weather. What surprised her most was not the relief, but the quiet. Not an empty quiet, but one that felt earned. Evenings were no longer something to endure or manage. They simply unfolded, sometimes alone, sometimes not. There was no need to label these moments as healing or growth. They existed without purpose, and that, in itself, felt unfamiliar. She did not rewrite the past. There was no urgency to reinterpret the marriage as a mistake or a lesson. It remained what it was, a chapter shaped by choices made with the understanding she had at the time. What changed was her relationship to the present. Without the weight of expectation, she found herself responding more honestly to what each day required. Less negotiation, less self-censorship. There were still moments of heaviness. Separation does not erase history. Certain memories surfaced unexpectedly, not with pain sharp enough to wound, but with a dull recognition of what had been carried for too long. The difference now was that she no longer had to suppress those moments for the sake of stability. They came and went without needing resolution. In public, she continued to appear composed, familiar. But the difference lay beneath that familiarity. She was no longer protecting a private narrative from exposure. There was nothing left to hide because there was nothing left to perform. Questions about her life no longer triggered the reflex to edit or deflect. If she chose not to answer, it was simply because she didn't want to, not because the truth was too fragile to touch. This afterlife of the relationship did not feel like victory. It felt like alignment. The outer life finally matching the inner one, without fanfare, without promises, without the pressure to prove that leaving had been worth it. She did not need the future to look beautiful. She only needed it to be honest. And so what remains is not a declaration, but a lingering question, one she does not answer directly, and perhaps never will. When a marriage ends quietly, without spectacle or blame, is that an ending at all? Or is it the first time a person allows themselves to exist without translation, without justification, without asking to be understood, simply present, simply real, for the first time in a very long while? There is a temptation, whenever a story reaches this point, to tidy it up, to assign meaning, to decide who was right, who endured more, who should have left sooner. But this story resists that impulse. It does not ask to be solved. It asks only to be sat with, quietly, without verdict. Lillian Dube does not frame her experience as a warning or a triumph. She does not claim clarity where there is still complexity. What she offers instead is something far less satisfying to a culture hungry for conclusions. Uncertainty that has been lived with long enough to become familiar. An understanding that truth does not always arrive fully formed, and that naming it does not require certainty. There are marriages that cannot be reduced to success or failure. They exist in the gray spaces between intention and outcome, between care and exhaustion. From the outside, they appear intact. From the inside, they are held together by routine, by responsibility, by a quiet hope that something might still shift if one remains patient enough. When they end, it is tempting to call that ending an answer. But often, it is only a pause, an acknowledgement that the questions were real all along. What lingers after her words is not explanation, but resonance. The recognition that staying can be an act of strength just as much as leaving can be. That endurance is not always evidence of fulfillment. That silence is not always consent. And that speaking, when it finally happens, is rarely about exposing another person. It is about reclaiming one's own breath. She does not ask to be understood completely. Perhaps she knows that complete understanding is a myth. What she seems to allow is the possibility that different truths can exist at the same time. That love and loneliness can share the same space. That responsibility can both sustain and suffocate. That a woman can do everything she was taught to do, and still arrive at a moment where she must choose herself, quietly, without applause. There is something unresolved here, and intentionally so. The marriage is neither redeemed nor condemned. The separation is neither liberation nor loss in any definitive sense. It is simply what happened when two inner lives no longer moved in the same direction. Anything beyond that would be an interpretation imposed from the outside. Perhaps that is the final lingering thought she leaves behind. Not as a lesson, but as an invitation. To consider how many stories we simplify because ambiguity makes us uncomfortable. To wonder how often we mistake silence for peace, endurance for love, stability for connection. To ask ourselves whether truth always needs to be loud to be valid. There are women who do not leave because they are weak, but because they have been strong for too long. And when they finally speak, it is not to accuse, not to explain, but simply to make room for air, for honesty, for the quiet possibility of living without having to hold everything together anymore,